Right? Okay, here we go. Hi Jen, thanks for coming today and participating in this. We really appreciate it. Would you like to share a little bit of your experience as a mom of a child with a hearing loss?
Sure. Well, thanks for inviting me to participate in this conversation. I guess I was looking at some of the questions that you posed, and they're really important questions, I think, for parents to share with others, especially people who are going to be working with our children in the classroom. And so I speak from personal experience, but also my experience with working with other deaf and hard of hearing children in the classroom as well. When Nolan was first diagnosed with a hearing loss, he was diagnosed later in life. He was almost 3 years old.
Oh.
And up until that time, he started talking when he was 10 months old, and he seemed to be hitting all the milestones. But then there were these subtle signs that we were noticing, my husband and I, about Nolan. Maybe I'll give you a couple examples. So one was that he would startle easily. Like his back would be turned to us, and we would be walking, and we'd be making noises with our footsteps, and then we would reach for Nolan, and he'd startle and he'd turn around, and we thought, well, that's strange. He should have heard us approaching, but he hadn't. And then when he was really young, he would always be looking at our mouth to see what we were saying, if we were learning a new song, things like that.
Yeah.
And then as he got older, close to 2 years old, he was really struggling with trying to express himself verbally. He was having difficult forming words, and he became very anxious and withdrawn when we would go into social situations or new situations. And we noticed that he would be always looking around, trying to figure out what was going on.
Wow.
And was confused. And these were very unlike signs of Nolan. He was usually a very gregarious child. And so we pursued getting his hearing and speech tested. And at first we were often told that, no, he's hitting all the milestones, and all the things that you're describing are what young children struggle with when they're learning language.
Right.
But with these personality changes and seeing him become very anxious and worried, we pursued the assessments. And once we did, we found out that Nolan was moderate to severe.
Wow.
Hearing loss in both ears.
I think parents always know. Mothers especially,
yes.
always know. Yeah.
Yes. And I just remember the day that Nolan came back from his hearing assessment at the audiology clinic, and he just kind of looked at me like, you finally figured it out. and from then on, we went to putting in supports and getting connected and figuring out what Nolan needed. But so finding out about his hearing loss was a relief in many ways. Then I started looking at the research and the statistics of deaf and hard of hearing learners in the schools and in society, and it became very bleak. The statistics aren't very good,
right? And
in terms of the challenges that they face,
and the support that they need.
That's right. And so then that got a bit depressing, and then that led to a lot of questions. Would Nolan maintain his levels, his hearing level, or would it diminish as he got older? What kinds of supports did we need to put in place for him as preschooler, and then as he moved on into K-12 and beyond? Would he have the access and opportunities to grow and develop like any other child? What kinds of challenges will we face? And then being hearing parents, how do we have to shift our mindset to respond and be responsive to Nolan's needs? What things had we taken for granted, assuming he could hear well? So those were some of the questions that we had.
Those are big questions for sure. And now that Nolan's been in the school system for a few years, what would you like people working with Nolan in the school system to be aware of or to know, or what's your vision of what it should be like for him at school?
I think sort of the main overarching goal for us as parents is that we want to work with the school, and that means work with the teachers, work with the support workers, work with the resources that are there, and work with the I said teachers already, the classroom assistants, and have Nolan be part of that process. Not talk about the child, but actually work with the learner. I think that's so key, and Nolan has been really part of every step that we go along. So if we find a challenge, it's Nolan who we talk to. We don't talk about Nolan, we talk with Nolan, and we try to problem solve and troubleshoot and figure out a way to make things work. And Nolan's needs are always changing, because he's growing, he's learning, he's different every day, and so we just sort of work along with that, and to know that he can achieve excellence like any other learner,
as long as he has access.
That's right. And so his needs may be different, but his goals aren't any different. Right. And I guess if I could pick three things, number one would be that deaf and hard of hearing children or learners are not like hearing people who can't hear. And that they come with, they perceive the world differently, they make sense of the world differently, and these differences aren't deficits, they are simply differences. And so while we need to recognize those, we don't see them as limitations for the children. And as a parent, some of the books, there's lots of information out there. Some of my favorites, I brought them along, is Oliver Sacks' book, Seeing Voices. And you can see, I read it a lot. And it sort of just gave me a window into understanding deafness and being hard of hearing. And then this other one, I've lent this book to someone, so I don't actually have the copy, so I printed it off it. And it's titled How Deaf Children Learn, What Parents and Teachers Need to Know. And it's by Marshak and Hauser. And that one I found very easily and accessible to parents and teachers, and we often share it with Nolan's team as he goes to school year to year. And then this one here, Teaching Deaf Learners, Psychological and Developmental Foundations by Knors and Marshak. And it's more research based, it's got a lot of research in it, but I find that Oliver Sacks' book and this other one by Marshak and Hauser to be very accessible, and it's important for not just parents but teachers and classroom assistants,
and speech paths and social workers, everybody who youth and family counselors.
That's right, to understand, because again, like I said, there's key differences in the way deaf and hard of hearing people, how they are. They're not deficits, they're just differences. The second is really, I found so important, was that children with mild hearing loss, they miss up to 50% of everything that's said in the classroom. That's huge.
And that's with no background noise or fans.
So I thought, well, that's mild hearing loss. Well, Nolan, he functions at severe hearing loss. So what does that mean for learners like Nolan? And so we need to think about, so for me, I'm thinking about, okay, so if a child with mild hearing loss misses up to 50%, well, verbal communication really isn't a good way to be communicating in the classroom.
No.
So what are all the nonverbal ways that we can communicate, and then link to language and all of that? But what are those nonverbal ways? Well, it's making things visual, it's written text, it's gestures, it's sign language, it's body language, right? It's all of those things, and not just doing it for the student, but actually doing it with the student, making the student aware that that's how they access information, right? That's how they learn. And for us, it's been really important not just to make the team that works with Nolan aware, but make Nolan aware so that he can be independent and that he can be his own learner.
Right.
Right. I think that's been really critical. The third, and this pertains to Nolan, is he's very verbal, and it's kind of a blessing and a curse. So while he's very verbal and he can articulate what he's thinking to others, that's great because he can interact with them and communicate with them in that way. However, then there's the assumption that he can hear well, you know, and he's functioning a severe hearing loss at the best of times, and so that can be misleading or so I think diminish the challenges that he faces as a deaf and hard of hearing learner.
And the understanding that he gets it without the realization that he has to work that much harder to get it.
That's right.
And the fatigue factor at the end of the day from working so much harder to pay attention to try to figure out what's going on around him.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So we kind of talked about some of the supports that you think are critical. Is there anything else you can think about? Or okay, good.
So
this is great.
I tried to narrow things down. Kind of goes like an accordion though, so as you narrow it down, you find new things.
Right.
I think for Nolan, it was to develop an early love for reading, like right from the get-go. So as soon as we found out that he was hard of hearing and he was 3 years old, we thought this kid has to love learning and love reading, reading, and that idea that if you read, the words stay still. The spoken word just flies by, right, and might not be noticed. So Nolan, from very early on, he would point to things, and we would show him the sign for it, and we post the visual hand shape on the door for the door, and we'd have a label maker, and we put DOOR, and so he had, trying to layer all that language on for him as very early on, and then just develop his love for reading. So he learned to read in kindergarten, and has just continued to he's a voracious reader, and I was just saying to Joe that we just throw books at him and he reads whatever books they are, historical books, scientific books, hockey books, all sorts of things, and he can get that information, and he doesn't have to depend on hearing others.
That's
to
great.
Get that information, right? The second point I think is important is to, while recognize what are the challenges for deaf and hard of hearing learners, pay attention to how they do learn, right? And so what are those ways that they learn that aren't verbal or spoken and heard? But what are all those other ways that we just talked about that are important? Because that's how we're going to enable them to achieve excellence, give them access to instruction, and for them to develop, to be confident,
right,
and independent, right? And then the third is, the power of ASL. American Sign Language. And at first I thought it was just a communication piece, but I've realized it's so much more. And that, just if we look at the practical situations, there's times when Nolan doesn't have his hearing aids in, and so we have to sign. Noisy situations, I mean, it's not just to Nolan. When we're in a noisy restaurant, our family just signs to each other because it makes more sense.
Right.
Sometimes there's physical barriers. Nolan might be on the other side of a window,
right,
on the bus. So we sign to each other. And so those are the 3 points that I would like to make.
That's great. So that was for the critical for a child to be successful at school. Is there anything else that you think is really important to add that people should think about?
Yeah, I think there's 3 more that I want to add.
Okay, perfect.
So number 1 is when we learned about Nolan's hearing loss, we learned that hearing aids don't fix hearing loss. That's really key. And the analogy is that hearing aids don't fix hearing loss the way glasses correct vision. And so glasses make things clearer to us, but hearing aids only make things louder and more accessible. He still has to figure out what sounds he needs to pay attention to, the other ones he needs to ignore. Then, oh, what's that noise that I heard mean, because I probably missed 50% of it.
Yeah.
And to fit it together, and that how much work it takes for him to process that information, and that, you know, sometimes the response will be delayed, but it isn't because he's having difficulty making sense of it. It's that it's just more work to actually produce a verbal response.
So waiting for a response
And giving time.
and giving time for that is important.
And then listening to simulations of hearing loss, right? When we learned that Nolan was hard of hearing, we thought, okay, so what's that like? And we were given the opportunity to hear what it's like to have a mild hearing loss, moderate, severe, and profound. And honestly, when I listened to that, I thought, oh my goodness, like what a hearing person takes for granted, being in a hearing world and having access to all that information. And I can honestly say that mild, the way I describe it is mild hearing loss, I'm straining to hear. Moderate, I've already given up on what's being said. It's just too much work for me. And I thought, well, Nolan's at severe.
Yeah.
And look how hard he's working
Right.
to hear.
Yeah, that's really important.
And then the last one is, or the third one is that it's not good enough for deaf and hard of hearing learners to be included in the classroom and learn how to cope, to develop strategies to cope in the classroom. That they are in the classroom and they should be excelling in the classroom. And those would be my 3 points today.
I think that's true, and I think they also have a right to access everything that's going on around them. So they need that support, not just in language arts, but in the gym they have a right to know what are the rules to the game, and all through access all the curriculum, all the way through.
And it's not just the academic, like just as much as
Social.
it's the social and the emotional. And you're not going to have a healthy, vibrant learner who's deaf and hard of hearing who, if they're only doing well in the academics, they want to contribute, and they can contribute.
Yeah.
They want to belong. They don't just want to be part of, they want to participate and contribute. And they can in so many wonderful ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. That was awesome. Really great.
Thank you.
Thank you.